is how Bobby Lee's lies almost read slant.
How far would you be willing to go for fame? How much would you be willing to sacrifice? Really think about this. Would you sacrifice your job, your family, your reputation? There's an ancient Chinese proverb that states, you must enter the tiger's den to catch his cubs. Essentially, it means you're not going to get a lot without risking a little. This is especially true in the world of stand-up comedy. Competition is fierce, and if you don't keep improving, you're likely to fall behind and be overtaken by someone younger, smarter, and more innovative. Every day, there's a fresh new batch of prospective comedians looking to make it big in the comedy scene, and potentially end up as the next revolving guest on Joe Rogan, or as a disciple of Dave Chappelle. In this environment, anyone looking to make a name for themselves will need to use every possible asset they have at their disposal, whatever it takes to set them apart from the crowd. Such as the subject of today's video, Bobby, someone whose nonchalant attitude towards the truth and tendency to exaggerate certain events would lead to both his highest highs and eventually his lowest lows. Bobby is an American stand-up comedian and actor with prominent roles in both movies and television. He recently starred in the Hulu series Reservation Dogs. However, on the wider internet, what he's really known for is his popular podcast Tiger Belly, where he and his ex-partner Kalila Kuhn discuss popular events in the entertainment industry as well as recount stories from their personal lives. Bobby himself was born in San Diego on September 17th of 1971. Now it's worth noting off the bat that Bobby has a lot of stories. The son of two Korean immigrants, Bobby got a rough start in life when, according to him, he was molested at age 9 by a man with Down syndrome. Now this was revealed on an episode of the Fighter and the Kid podcast, and it's extremely difficult to tell if he's joking or not, but he said it a few times outside of this, and it's on his Wikipedia, so we're gonna go with it.
Did it look down?
I don't really remember, but it was just like it did.
Get him down, he says! These are legit. I don't know, man.
That's not why they call him Down syndrome.
Spitballing ideas here.
I want you to look at my face.
I'm trying to figure this out.
Don't play innocent.
Don't play innocent.
That was a play on words.
Perhaps as a result of this event or some other issues he was facing, Bobby began to engage in drug use, both marijuana as well as amphetamines at only 12 years old. His childhood wasn't easy as his father was abusive towards him and his mother and provided him with none of the love or kindness that you would expect a typical father to provide.
When we're born, we need several things. We need to be fed. We need to be held.
Is he ever on the Jogging podcast?
We need to be loved and nurtured, right? And we want to feel safety. I didn't get that.
Definitely not the safety.
Yeah, I got some love.
No, I guess it was David Shaw.
I got a lot of violence. You know, I saw my dad knock my mom's teeth out and beat down with golf clubs and stuff. You know, I have a hard time sleeping because my brother and I couldn't sleep because at like 2, 3 in the morning you would hear dishes crash against the wall.
Only a few years later at 17, he had moved on to harder drugs as well. According to Lee, he went through 3 different drug rehab programs before becoming clean at the age of 17.
It's all from my childhood. The reason why I do stand-up is because of my childhood.
The hating yourself or like being self-critical, that has to do with your childhood.
Yeah.
So the drugs and drinking, childhood.
It's all about survival and protecting your heart, you know. And there were ways that I did that as a kid, like using humor as a defense mechanism.
But Bobby didn't start out looking for a career in stand-up. After moving out of his parents' house, he spent a few years working various jobs around San Diego while spending his free time skateboarding and just hanging out, much to the disappointment of his parents. However, fate struck in 1994 when the coffee shop he was working at in San Diego closed, leaving Bobby without a job. As luck would have it, right next door to his previous job was the Comedy Store in San Diego. Bobby decided to apply for a job there and was accepted almost instantly. He would spend his first few months doing odd jobs around the club. After only working there for a short time, Bobby himself decided to try and take his own shot at comedy by taking part in one of the amateur nights. And according to him, he got off to a rough start. I think I showed them my butt and made some noises and went off stage. It was embarrassing. Not to be deterred by his terrible first attempts, Bobby decided to practice stand-up over the next few months and hone his craft. As fate would have it, within a year of working at the club, Bobby met 2 other comedians who helped him jumpstart his career. The first of these comedians was Pauly Shore, a prolific actor in 90s comedy films. During one of the open mic nights, Pauly happened to be in attendance and seemingly liked Bobby and his unique style of humor. The second person to notice Bobby was none other than the infamous comedian Carlos Mencia. Mencia hired Bobby to accompany him on a tour as his opener, and because of this, Bobby viewed him as the father figure he never had and was fiercely loyal to him, sometimes to a fault.
When it comes to Carlos, in the mid-90s is when I met him. I was a doorman at the La Jolla Comedy Store. He brought me on the road. He introduced me to Matt Blake, my agent, right? And he bought me a car when I couldn't pay rent, you know, and I was really desperate. I could always go to him for money, and he helped me out in so many different ways.
His first gig in the actual television industry came when he was hired to the cast of Mad TV in 2001. Mad TV was a television series that ran from the mid-90s until 2009. You could consider it as an early version of what would eventually become the golden age of YouTube creators like Smosh, Shane Dawson, and other sketch comedians on YouTube. Basically, it was a collection of highly produced, zany, over-the-top comedy skits stitched together into a 30-minute television block.
Is this senior citizen right for the White House?
Paul.
At the POW camp, John McCain was not helpful. He never gave us the information we requested, no matter how many times we asked him.
Uncooperative.
While the Mad TV gig certainly helped his burgeoning career, Lee himself hated the job. His lack of proper acting experience in front of a live audience and relatively small amount of screen time made him hate the show early in his run. He would grow increasingly frustrated with the job as he perceived the Mad TV producers to be purposely ignoring and dismissing any pitches he had for episodes.
I didn't talk to Mike McDonald for 3 years.
Okay.
You know, I don't think I ever really even talked to Stephanie.
Stephanie Weir?
Weir. Yeah. She would say hi and stuff.
I couldn't even get on the fucking thing.
Actually, ignore.
He said about his first 2 years on the show, I would pitch and I could not get any of my stuff on. Bobby hated the beginning of his career on Mad TV. He hated it so much that he was quoted saying, the first 2 years were the worst 2 years of my life. He quickly became disillusioned with his new job due to the lack of roles he was provided and the lack of input he was getting on the production side. This would cause him to once again turn to drugs, relapsing on alcohol and abusing the prescription drug Vicodin. He would purposefully show up to work extremely late or not at all, and when he did show, he would be obliterated. Towards the end of Bobby's second year on the show, he was given one final chance to clean things up by the producers before he would be fired for good after Mad TV producer Lauren Dombrowski fought for him to remain on the show. Bobby would greatly appreciate this gesture and finally get sober again after this intervention. Even after his issues with drug abuse were taken care of, Bobby still didn't like many of the aspects of working on the show. As he was the only Asian American on staff, he would be forced to perform every single Asian role that was written, both the good and the bad. He despised performing what he described as average Asian skits and hated performing as certain reappearing characters such as Connie Chung or Bae Sung. Rather than playing a character, Bobby preferred to just play himself, putting himself into weird situations and reacting how he himself would in real life.
My name is Bobby Lee. Spent 7 years on a sketch show. I played dozens of Asian stereotypes and shown my junk to thousands of strangers. Now I am about to embark on my greatest adventure yet. This is Lee versus Wild.
Saying what?
Come on, guys, you guys have tons of bottled water. Just give me one.
No, Bobby, can't help you. Those are the rules.
Whatever!
This is when he truly found his own personal voice on the show. He would stay there for 8 years until Fox canceled it in 2009. He would spend the next few years taking various acting gigs and performing sets at comedy clubs around the country. Even though he was being very well received and respected within the LA comedy scene by this time, Bobby chose not to produce any television specials and still is not to this day, despite figures as prominent as Joe Rogan telling him to. He stated on many
He's on Ali on.
occasions that he simply doesn't feel the need to do one, but the common sentiment among many of his fans is a lot sadder. Bobby is so insecure that he doesn't think he's good enough to make one.
In my head, it's like, in my 20s, they too were very depressing. And I didn't know that I was ever going to become, you know, a successful comedian and TV. All the stuff that I have, podcast, I'm a beautiful girl, great girl, intelligent girlfriend. You know, in my 20s, I was this blubbering kid. I used to very depressed, suicidal, hated myself. And
Despite his fame and fortune, one thing that is a consistent character flaw of Bobby is that he constantly struggles with low self-esteem and not believing he's good enough to get anywhere in his life or career without resorting to underhanded methods. It's this flaw that would cause him to suffer the loss of a close friend and the eventual onslaught of physical assault that would arise from it. When talking about conflicts involving Bobby Lee, the one that most quickly comes to mind, and the one that the largest number of people are probably aware of, is Bobby's infamous feud with fellow comedian and former friend Ari Shaffir. Bobby and Ari ran in similar spaces in the LA stand-up scene, meaning they would often perform sets at the same clubs and meet with similar people. The beginning of this long and confusing tale apparently begins one night at the Comedy Store, where Bobby Lee was set to perform. Bobby had brought along his friend and veteran Mad TV actor Ron Peterson with him that night, and after entering the building, they both went up to the Belly Room. The Belly Room is the name of a smaller stage at the LA Comedy Store, reserved for events that are expected to have a smaller attendance than will be needed for the large theater. When they entered the Belly Room, they saw that another comedian named Natasha Leggero was already performing on stage. At this time, Natasha was dating Ari Shaffir, and the two were in a committed relationship. Ron saw Natasha on stage and remarks to Bobby, "Damn, that girl's hot." Unsure of how to respond, Bobby simply said, yeah, she's dating my friend Ari." To which Ron quite respectfully responded with, "I don't care, I don't know the guy." Before Bobby was able to give a retort, he had to go down to the main stage area to perform a set, so he simply brushed the comment off and went downstairs
That's a dick move.
to begin his performance.
so I go down to the OR to just set. He stayed up there. He got her number. Then we leave. I don't know anything about it at that point, but apparently he's now wooing
love letters,
sending her
flowers.
flowers.
Later in the night after the show, Bobby would hear from some other friends that Ron had stayed in the Belly Room with Natasha and even got her number. At this point, Bobby went home, and that was all he was aware of at this time regarding that incident. But this wouldn't be the end, as over the coming months, Ron began showering Natasha with love letters, flower bouquets, gifts, and trips to the opera, among many other romantic gestures. Now, at this point, it may be important to mention that Natasha already had a reputation for getting around in the LA comedy scene, serially dating many male comedians, and even allegedly attempting to get with Joe Rogan. During the period of Ron's advancements towards Natasha, Ari Shaffir had the password to her email account for other reasons. After seeing the emails from Ron in her inbox, Ari began to read through all of them, discovering Natasha's infidelity. At first, he considered simply blocking Ron and hoping that Natasha would assume he simply stopped responding to her and just wasn't interested. In the end, his better judgment won out, and he decided to give her the choice to do the right thing and tell him straight up.
I had her password for her email, and I was reading the
Boom. Boom.
And you went crazy.
I mean, I was like, what do I do here? I was thought of like just blocking his email so that she wouldn't know, so that it would be like, I guess he's not emailing me anymore.
Right.
But then I was like, no, I'll let her make the right decision. That's a mistake. Never.
This did not happen, and instead, the flirting between Ron and Natasha became more and more apparent. Things would escalate to the point that while Ari was present in her apartment, Natasha would pick up her phone and walk into another room to brazenly flirt with Ron over the phone. Ari is now well aware that Natasha is cheating and obviously does not care for the relationship. At this point, he's torn and wants to try and salvage their relationship because he genuinely loves her and wants to remain with her. And this is where things start to get hazy. Bobby has repeated this story many times throughout the years. Whenever he used to tell a story on his podcast, at a club, or at any other event, he always claims that Ari called him and said that Natasha had broken up with him after he found out they were cheating and asked Bobby what he should do about it. However, many years later, when Bobby was on a podcast with Ari, he was confronted about this lie, at which point Bobby sheepishly admits that Ari is correct and that in reality, Bobby was the one who called Ari to let him know that he saw Ron and Natasha together because Ron had asked him to find out if they were fully broken up or not.
And so then I was, crying in the bathtub.
Oh no.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, man.
And Bobby called me, and Bobby called me, and he was like, "Hey, what happened?"
Some drama.
I was driving down Sunset or down Hollywood. I saw them going to the opera.
Yeah.
I was like, "What?" And you're like, "Yeah, I saw them go to the opera, and I don't know what it is. I just want to know." And I pieced together pieces that you were calling me because Ron was like, "Hey, find out if they're still dating or if they fully broke up."
Oh, I did not know this part of the story.
I pieced it together. After,
Hold
when I
Hold on,
screamed
so
a
you're
little
telling me
All right,
yeah.
that you were conspiring in
No,
the
he
cheating?
was caught in the middle. To be
No,
honest.
I'm gonna say this. And okay, let's just get this straight.
Yeah.
Oh, there are two sides to every story.
I sort of listen to what I have to say first, okay?
In the same podcast, Bobby explains the reasons why he called Ari, saying that he was so torn because while Ari Shaffir was his friend, he was still new on Mad TV, and Bobby had only recently gotten sober again after having many issues with drugs and attendance on set as previously mentioned. Bobby said he desperately needed Ron to like him since he was a Mad TV veteran, so he wanted to be in his good graces. Ron was especially important because unlike everyone else who auditioned to get on the show, the producer liked Ron so much that Ron was personally chosen by the producer to be in the show without any audition. After weighing all of his options, Bobby decided that the best course of action would be to call Ari, as Ron had requested him to. Bobby believed that if he told Ari that Ron was with Natasha, Ron would be pissed at him and it would jeopardize his relationship with Ron and also Martin Short, who was a huge deal in Canada at the time.
I'm new on Mad,
So
a couple
is he.
years in.
Yeah, couple
He's new
years,
also. It's still, in Mad terms, that's pretty
Okay,
new,
okay.
okay? You're not a regular yet, you're still
We're in the
featuring
bad
or
terms,
whatever,
yeah.
okay?
Uh-huh.
Here's a guy who, he didn't audition. What happened was Martin Short.
Oh, they need more white people.
No, but Martin Short found him in Canada.
Oh, right,
And
Canadian.
personally came down with Ron.
Oh, that's why he went right back to Canada.
Right.
He decided his career was more important and decided to withhold the information from Ari. Bobby would later apologize to Ari and claim that when he was younger, he was extremely opportunistic and would always put his career in comedy first, which would end up gaining him quite a few enemies and losing him quite a few friends.
Got the opportunities or whatever.
After the phone call, Ari would again contact Bobby. He asked Bobby to break into Ron's office at Mad TV and see what Natasha had been sending him, and if he didn't, his unwillingness to help him would force him to believe that Bobby set Ron and Natasha up to help his career. Bobby refused this ultimatum, and after refusing, Ari told Bobby to never speak to him again before ceasing all communication. It may be worth noting that another reason for this volatile interaction was that Bobby owed Ari over $5,000 which he had borrowed and not given back. With all of this information, it's understandable why Ari would be upset, but that doesn't explain why he chose to blame Bobby for the breakup entirely. It seems that Ari was taking out all the anger he had about the breakup on Bobby, which is somewhat fair considering he didn't tell him information he probably should have known, being that his girlfriend was cheating on him, but at the same time his girlfriend did that in the first place, not Bobby. Even if Ari never wanted to talk to Bobby again, it would make sense to at least ask Natasha if Bobby set the two up before parting ways for good, instead of just assuming that was the case after asking Bobby to hack his coworker's computer. Later, Bobby came out and said that he attempted to call Natasha and ask her to tell Ari it wasn't him who set the two up, and even though Natasha knew that was the case, she refused to let him know, something that
Was with a 6.
she would continue to avoid talking about even years later, and she continues to not speak on this to this day.
I can see you not talking to Ari, but not talking to me. That's kind of rude.
But can I tell you why, though?
Okay, if you want.
I asked you, can you call him and tell him that had nothing to do with you and Ron?
Call Ari?
Yeah, and you're like, I'm not gonna call Ari.
A few months after this incident, Ari Shaffir was once again performing on set at the Comedy Store. Though some time had passed, Ari was still extremely upset about the breakup. After performing the first set of the night, Ari went backstage as the second act of the night came up to begin their set. At this point, Ari began to vent his frustration about the breakup to fellow comedian Steve Ranazisi, who happened to be a mutual friend of both Bobby Lee and Ari Shaffir. Steve says that during this discussion, Ari Shaffir was deflecting the blame for his breakup and blaming everything on Bobby for causing it. While Ari was in the middle of talking to Steve, Bobby Lee, who was also set to perform that night, approached the two comedians and gestured to Ari before asking, "Hey, can I talk to you?" After hearing this, Ari walked over to Bobby and punched him directly in the face. Lee was then knocked to the ground by this hit, and Ari continued to mercilessly assault him with punches and kicks. Despite the ongoing assault, Lee chose not to fight back. Things came to a head when Ari grabbed Bobby's throat with both of his hands and began attempting to choke him while delirious. This is when Steve chose to step in and break up the fight to prevent Ari from killing him. Probably the right choice considering the situation. I wouldn't want beaten to death at a comedy club on my gravestone either. The second beating, and yes, there's a second, would be started over the $5 grand that Bobby owed Ari, as we mentioned before. Now, according to Bobby, he parked his car illegally, which led it to being towed by the city. And I'm not joking here. Bobby says that back then he literally didn't know that you could go get an impounded car back.
I thought that once a car is gone, you just have to go get another one. So I went back to Eric. I gotta get another
It's
one.
not a piece of gum.
Okay,
Well, this one's done. I had to just grab a new one.
Years later, I found out you can call. You know what I mean?
The cops.
Yeah, I didn't do any of that.
Insurance.
Gone.
So you went and bought another car.
Yes.
What was the second one?
GTI.
You bought the same car.
So after believing his car was stolen by the city and melted down into scrap metal, Bobby then apparently went out and purchased the exact same car for over $20,000, an amount that is certainly over what you could reasonably afford on the salary of a small-time stand-up comedian. To help with his debt, Bobby asked Ari Shaffir for some money, which is why he originally gave Bobby the $5 grand in the first place. Once at the Comedy Store, Ari and Bobby would manage to run into each other. Although this time, Ari began to immediately run towards Bobby after spotting him in the hallway, and he then began to choke him, asking where the money was. It got so bad that Ari's nails began digging into Bobby Lee's neck so much that he was bleeding, at which point concerned bystanders rushed over to break the two apart.
So then the week later, you come up to me and say, "I want my money," and you strangled me in the hallway. I remember because there was
actually insane.
blood.
For the second
I was like, it was like a two-finger.
Yeah.
I was like this, like that, and then you were like, ooh, like I was like, hey, I want my money.
Yeah.
After the first beating, Bobby says he didn't really hate Ari and just thought he was going a little nuts over his loss of a beloved partner. But after the second one, Bobby actually started to hate Ari and claims that he suffered PTSD-like symptoms. In my opinion, this is where Ari goes from somewhat understandable to outright malicious. Bobby wasn't full to his friend 100%, but you would think that after getting a wail on someone for 5 minutes with no resistance, you would be able to get that out of your system. Going on to then assault the same person the second time is pretty insane, especially considering Bobby did nothing to provoke him in the hallway. Ari just ran towards him and started choking the life out of him, like a pit bull that caught a glimpse of an unattended toddler. However, it would seem that 2 choking attempts weren't quite enough for Ari, as a third assault was soon to come. As stated previously, after the second beating, Bobby began to resent Ari. This hatred is what inevitably brought about the final attack. Ari had previously landed a spot on the, at the time, extremely popular Mind of Mencia TV show, but after the second beating, he was mysteriously dropped from the show with no apparent explanation. And if you recall from earlier, Carlos Mencia was one of the first people to recognize Bobby's ability as a comic, and they were very good friends. Bobby saw him as a father figure, not just a peer, a father figure. Due to this, Ari assumed that Bobby had called Mencia and told him to remove him from the show. However, Bobby states to this day that he did not call Carlos and he had no part in Ari's removal. Carlos Mencia himself stated on a podcast that Bobby actually did call him and asked that Ari be removed from the episode, but both Carlos and Bobby have equally terrible records when it comes to telling the truth, so what really happened is still up for debate. After realizing that Bobby was allegedly the one who got him dropped from the show, Ari was livid. His reasoning was that comedy is such a tough spot to find jobs, and that taking a job away from someone is completely beyond the pale. A couple months after the second incident, the third beating would occur at, yep, you guessed it, the Comedy Store. Bobby was standing outside the store waiting to get inside when he heard running from behind him. At first, he was confused by where it was coming from, but soon realized when Ari came up and punched him in the back of the head. Bobby got knocked to the ground, but after picking himself up, ran inside to call the cops. Bobby picked up the phone and started to dial 911, but their mutual friend
On the back of the head.
Steve ran in and physically ripped the phone cord out of the wall. He pleaded with Bobby not to call the police since it was a Friday, which meant that Ari would be stuck in jail over the entire weekend. Bobby eventually relented and did not end up calling the cops. After fleeing the scene, Ari heard that Bobby had gone to call the police, so he took his car and ended up staying outside hiding until 2 a.m. the next day, figuring the cops would come to his apartment to arrest him.
So I'm at the parking lot at the Comedy Store, and I just hear running. And when you hear running, you just think that people are talking, whatever. You don't think that someone's gonna do a Superman punch from behind.
I was talking to Damon Shevitz. I saw Bobby. And I go, excuse me, David. I something. Real calm.
After the whole situation was over, Ari was hit with a 1-month ban from the Comedy Store for the whole ordeal. Ari, most likely realizing that he would be facing actual prison time if he assaulted Bobby again, decided to stop attacking. Not because he was remorseful or anything, just wanted to avoid Uncle Sam throwing him in the slammer. The two comedians would throw insults and jabs at each other while continuing to have zero contact for the next 4 to 5 years. After some time had passed, Ari Shaffir called Bobby Lee and told him that he was sorry for everything he had done and understood that if he never wanted them to see each other again, that was completely fair. They would go their separate ways and not get into any more conflicts. But he also said that if Bobby was open to it, he would like to be friends again. It seems that time had also helped Bobby himself mature and grow as a person, as he forgave Ari, saying that his resentment had long since subsided and he would like to be friends as well. After 5 long years of continuous back and forth, the two comedians once again became friends and went right back to the way things were before that fateful night at the Comedy Store. And they've since talked about this saga numerous times. When speaking about successful podcasters, the uncontested king of the genre is Joe Rogan. His name is almost synonymous with podcasting itself, with Rogan helping to pioneer the format that would eventually come to define much of the internet's content consumption, long before every semi-successful comedian and washed-up YouTube celebrity had a podcast, obviously not including myself, of course. It was an extremely niche genre, only available to those with the technical expertise and expensive equipment required to make something that didn't sound like it was recorded with a 2007 Xbox 360 mic and then edit it into an easily consumable form. The story of the first interaction between Bobby Lee and Joe Rogan begins back in 2011. In only the 76th episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, Bobby Lee and Rogan discussed the infamous story of how they met. The episode began with Bobby apologizing to Rogan for another more recent drama he had been at the center of. Bobby, believing Rogan was angry with him, said that he was sorry for getting involved in it and that he should have kept his mouth shut. The reason why? Well, just a few months earlier, Joe Rogan had confronted Carlos Mencia for allegedly stealing jokes from other comedians. The whole interaction was caught on camera, and after it was uploaded, many other comedians began to chime in, alleging that Mencia had stolen material from them as well. If you'll recall from earlier, Carlos Mencia was one of the first people to give Bobby Lee a shot in the comedy industry and even took him on the road for comedy tours. Because of this, Bobby likely believed that he owed Carlos a lot for helping him out in the past, so in retaliation, he would upload a video of himself defending Mencia. Essentially, Bobby said that Carlos, in fact, did not steal any material and was actually just a super swell guy.
And I've never seen him steal a joke. He never stole a joke from me, and I don't know where Joe Rogan gets the information that
Jesus, copy him.
I called him to tell him that Carlos steals because I never called Joe.
Considering the mountain of evidence people had against Mencia as far as plagiarism, it probably comes as no surprise that things didn't go over well with the fans. The video was originally uploaded in 4:3 aspect ratio due to that being the most popular and widely used format at the time. So when viewed on a modern display, it looks like the video was poorly cropped with large black bars on both sides. The top comment on the video accurately represents the sentiment of the general audience by jokingly asking if anyone has the full 16:9 widescreen version of the clip, because it appears that the gun being pointed at Bobby's head by Carlos Mencia is cropped out. Despite Bobby Lee seemingly believing that Joe Rogan would be mad at him for the video, Rogan didn't appear fazed, likely because he knew Bobby was lying trying to cover his friend's ass, considering that there was video evidence of Bobby and Rogan together where he said that Carlos had stolen jokes in the past.
Yeah, Nat, do a couple minutes using material. Well, I'll just do some of my material and then it'll get us in. So.
Funnily enough, in the very same clip, Rogan chastises Bobby, saying people like him, who are afraid of confrontation, are the reason comedians get away with stealing jokes. With the potential beef squash, the two began to discuss the story of their first meeting. There have been several other occasions since this episode where both Bobby and Joe have retold this story, and both of them appear to change minor details many times over the years, either in an effort to paint themselves in a more positive light, or because it's been so long they've genuinely forgot. Bobby would even end up stating that Joey Diaz was there, to which Diaz immediately responded saying he wasn't. Surely Bobby would know that such an obvious lie would be immediately discredited, so it seems far more likely that with age he's forgotten some of the details of their encounter. Either way, they both seem to agree on the events in the 76th episode of the JRE podcast, so that's what most people consider to be the true series of events. The interaction is a perfect example of Bobby's tendency to talk big, and how it's caused him many issues since the very beginning of his life, getting to the point where Bobby could have created a timeline where Joe Rogan is buried in a shallow grave somewhere in the Mexican desert, and the Joe Rogan experience never even existed. It goes back to the year 1996. At this time, Bobby was 23 and currently working as a doorman in San Diego. He'd only been doing comedy for a very short time and had only managed to move out of his hometown of Poway, California, a mere 2 months prior. While living in San Diego and performing sets at the local clubs, he got the once-in-a-lifetime chance to meet up with Joe Rogan. Now keep in mind, this is far before Rogan would become a household name. At this time, he was still going around the country doing stand-up gigs, and it just happened that Rogan arrived in town to do a set at the Comedy Store the very same night as Bobby Lee. At the club,
He did also organize quite a big
he met
deal.
up with Bobby and another comedian, Jimmy Schubert, who was also performing at the same location. After a successful night at the club, the three of them decided it would be a good idea to hit the nearby strip club to keep the night going. While Joe and Bobby were sober, Jimmy Schubert had a few drinks in him and decided to ask for a private lap dance from one of the strippers. As Jimmy was talking to the dancer, Joe happened to overhear some other people talking about how the stripper was the girlfriend of one of the local Mexican gangbangers who were also at the strip club. He looked over to see the gang members and noticed they were very obviously the real deal. All of them were jacked and well armed, each of them sporting the notorious tear eye tattoos. Rogan looked at one of them who had what he described as crazy murderer eyes, and this was enough to convince him to leave the club right then and there. After noticing what Jimmy was doing, one of the gang members came over to confront Jimmy, and he began profusely apologizing. Seeing the gang member accost Jimmy, Bobby Lee turned to Rogan and started saying that the guys weren't, and they were obviously who were just bluffing. He said this quite loudly, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, and after hearing Bobby, the other members of the gang started to get up and approach them. Joe told Bobby that he was leaving right there without them, and if either of them wanted to come, they had to leave right then because they were moments away from being shot. This was enough to get both of them to quickly leave the club.
He was so incredulous. Even now we were waiting to get in the car. You guys overreacting.
So
I think
bad.
what's wrong with car. Yeah. I'm like, I've seen murderers before. I've met them.
Yeah,
There's a certain tweak in a person's eye when they've already killed somebody.
What's important to remember is that this happened back in the 1990s when you didn't need a passport to cross the Mexican border. The strip club they were in just so happened to be about 20 minutes away from Tijuana, a Mexican city known for being a hotspot of illegal activity. Despite them managing to end the night with their heads still attached to their bodies, fate would have it that this wouldn't be the only time Lee would have trouble stemming from the city of Tijuana. Anyone who spent a decent amount of time online is very likely familiar with the phrase, the internet never forgets. That isn't entirely true. To this day, we still don't know where the infamous Jeff the Killer image came from. That being said, there is a growing culture of people who seek to find old dirt on others to harm their career. It seems that currently, the best way to gain some quick internet clout is to expose somebody for something they did in the past. There's been countless examples of this in the past few years, especially with comedians having their past edgy jokes, or more seriously, misdeeds from years or decades prior, being wheeled out in front of a new audience. And Bobby Lee's no exception, but he is a very unique case. All the way back on November 17th of 2014, Bobby Lee would make a guest appearance on the DVD ASA podcast, hosted by David Cho and Asa Akira. For the first half of the podcast, Bobby talks with the host about random topics and current events, but trouble begins halfway through when he starts to tell a story that would eventually come back to haunt him. Before he even started the story, Bobby Lee would joke that this story could, quote, ruin his career, if only he knew how true that was. Bobby claimed that he used to work at a restaurant in Tijuana, as it was very close to where he grew up. He said that back when he was younger in the 1990s, you didn't need a passport across the border, so it was incredibly easy to go back and forth
What's
between his
with
home and
the
work. Apparently in
blur?
Tijuana, there was a place close to the restaurant that the locals referred to as Hooker Alley, where there were a lot of girls working as women of the night. Bobby said that since he wasn't familiar with the area or the people, he wasn't aware of any of the girls' ages. He claims that when he was younger, he didn't talk to any girls, and he was still a virgin at the time he was working at this restaurant. So he wanted to go to this alley and finally get with a girl in exchange for payment. After managing to work up the courage to go there, Bobby said he walked around the alley until he saw a girl facing a brick wall and knew that she was the one. The reason he chose her was apparently because she seemed scared, and that made Bobby want to be with her. According to Lee, the girl looked like Natalie Portman from the movie Lee on the Professional, and quipped that she was actually not that young, but I don't know how old. Bobby said that the girl grabbed his shirt and asked if he wanted her services, which he agreed to, so they both went into a room together. After finishing the story, Bobby said that he felt bad about the whole thing afterward, and the two hosts joked around for a bit before Asa jokingly said, maybe she wasn't a hooker, maybe she was waiting for her mom, before they moved on to another topic. The episode was uploaded to the DVD ASA podcast channel without much controversy and was received well at the time. This would change 6 years later on August 7th, 2020, when a Reddit user would upload the clip to Streamable before posting the clip to the subreddit r/standup with the title, Bobby Lee admits to raping a child prostitute in Tijuana, where it would accumulate 1,800 Reddit chungus updates over the next 3 years.
I'm gonna be completely
I'm not sure we score what, bruh.
honest with you. This story could ruin my career. So there's a street under
Inte consensual
in back of
maybe.
Adelita, and we used to call it Hooker Alley. Hooker Alley had the really ugly ones that couldn't go in, and they had girls that we didn't know what their ages were. And at the end of the thing, there was this girl, and she had her face toward the brick wall. That's when I knew she was the one. And I go, hey, you know, and she goes, you want to, you know, boom, boom, whatever. I go, yeah.
Maybe she wasn't even a hooker. Maybe she was like waiting for her mom.
After the Reddit post, Bobby Lee would appear on a 2020 episode of This Past Weekend, a podcast created by comedian Theo Von. Probably deciding it wasn't a great idea to have his name attached to that Reddit post, Bobby would once again tell the exact same story to Theo Von, with the only difference being that in this retelling of the story, the girl was an adult. Again, this didn't cause any controversy, and the episode was well received by fans. It would be another 3 years before the original
So bad.
2014 clip would reappear and begin outrage once again. While we can't say why exactly it resurfaced when it did, the most likely explanation was that Bobby was hitting a bit of a high. He was gaining a lot of public media exposure while doing interviews for his role in the upcoming Hulu original show, Reservation Dogs, meaning that anyone looking to get the maximum amount of attention for exposing Bobby would want to do it at that time since there were so many eyes on him. The second round of outrage began on December 15th, 2022, when a TikTok user going by the handle @I'mJustXander posted a version of the Tijuana story he summarized and then ended by calling Lee a p***o. This clip managed to garner over 2.4 million views in 4 months. Then, once again, the allegation was brought up a few months later on February 9th, 2023, after another TikToker going by the name @ThePodcastPoppy posted a clip from the second retelling of the story with Theo Von that gained an equally large amount of views with over 1.4 mil in 2 months. With so much coverage of this event, many mainstream publications smelled blood in the water and began to publish stories about the current Bobby Lee controversy on websites like Crack.com and USA Today. With a lot of mounting criticism over the clip, Bobby Lee would be confronted by the media in 2023, who demanded a response. He vehemently denied any allegations and then claimed that none of this actually happened and it was simply a story that he made up for shock value.
So, you know, at the time I had 2 jokes in my act, right? The first joke, and they would only work maybe 40%, 30% of the time.
Surely was back.
The first joke was, oh, it's not as bad. It's like, you know, I went on a date the other day, she seemed pretty young, she looked like Natalie Portman. Pause. From the movie Professional, right? Laugh. It's a switch.
Yeah.
That's what that kind of joke is.
Bobby responded to the media by saying that the Tijuana story was a combination of two different unsuccessful jokes he had told in past tours. The first part of the fake story came from a joke he told about going on a date with a young girl who looked like 12-year-old Natalie Portman from Leon the Professional, which is why he made that comparison. He then said that the second portion of the joke about the girl crying came from a bit he had previously done about speeding up the process of intercourse with his ex-girlfriend, who started crying in the middle of the act because she had begun thinking about her recently deceased grandma. After responding to the media, Bobby would address the situation on an episode of Tiger Belly and make a formal apology, saying, "I understand the uproar and why people are upset about it. I'm upset about it, and I punish myself over it every second of every day. At the end of the day, it's not real, and I didn't do anything." Bobby also addressed why he chose to even tell the story on the podcast episode in the first place, saying that back then he would often encourage to say crazy stuff without actually thinking about the consequences of it.
What happened before was like they make fun of you, and so I wanted to get ahead of it, and I was like, no, I'm gonna rip myself apart. And the second thing I did was, I'm just gonna say the craziest they've ever heard, because that's what that show was. You know, you have to understand it was before cancel culture, and the things that we're saying were, you know what I mean, at a high level of shock.
He finished up with a formal apology, reiterating how remorseful he was for the harm he caused, and finally saying, "When I listen back to it now, it puts a chill down my spine." Interestingly enough, before Bobby himself even officially responded to the story, Ethan Klein from H3 Productions said on the H3 podcast that he had previously spoken to Lee about the story, and that Lee claimed it was a joke. Bobby Lee had been on the H3 podcast several times over the years and could be considered a semi-regular guest on the show. He likely considered Ethan a friend, which explains why he would tell him before going public with a response. Whether you consider this to be cancel culture gone awry or righteous condemnation for a tasteless joke is up to your interpretation. But regardless of where you fall, it's safe to say that this is yet another case of Bobby's tendency to open his mouth when he shouldn't, leading to yet another instance of him digging his own grave. After Fox canceled Mad TV in 2009, Bobby continued to perform stand-up and made appearances in many different television and film productions. While these gigs weren't nothing, they weren't the kind of thing that was going to make Bobby a household name. So his next big break came in 2015 when he started doing this podcast named Tiger Belly. Podcasting had already proven to be a successful way of making money, pioneered by figures like Joe Rogan, and many stand-up comedians were choosing to start their own podcasts as a way of reaching more people through the internet than they traditionally could have through in-person events and shows. And on top of that, podcasts were stable income outside of touring. They could even help promote a tour. Bobby Lee first pitched his podcast idea to the All Things Comedy Network that had been co-created by fellow comedian Bill Burr. He was immediately signed on by the network, but reportedly never had the time to meet with the agency in person. During this time period, Lee and his then partner Kalila Kuhn were in the Philippines visiting Kalila's parents. While they were there, Kuhn began to suffer from severe heart issues. Due to this, she spent weeks at a time in the hospital and was unable to return to her previous nursing job. With all of his newly found free time and her need to stay home, Kalila chose to start a podcast to keep her busy. Bobby would occasionally make appearances on her show as a guest, and reportedly, their chemistry together was so great that Lee opted to spend time focusing on the podcast together with Kuhn in lieu of his acting and stand-up jobs. The podcast began to grow massively, and as Tiger Belly gained more and more fans, it became apparent that they would need more help to handle such a large operation. They decided to enlist the help of Bobby's friend Gilbert, who he had met at a Manny Pacquiao boxing match. Later on in the podcast run, Bobby would also take on George Kimmel to be the producer for Tiger Belly, whom Bobby met while he was working as a producer for The Station, a comedy channel under Disney's Maker Studios division. To anyone unfamiliar with the LA comedy scene, the name Brendan Schaub is almost synonymous with failure. Holding the impressive title of having two of the lowest-rated comedy specials of all time, there are very few people who have managed to garner as much resentment and disdain as Schaub has. If you're unaware of Schaub and just hearing this for the first time, you might mistakenly believe he gained this notoriety because of political takes or some sort of previous cancellation from years ago. You know, typical comedian stuff, right? But unlike many other hated comedians,
famous because of the jargon.
like Amy Schumer, Brendan has managed to make himself reviled by every stripe of the political spectrum without so much as opening his mouth about politics. The best term to describe Brendan would be jack of all trades, master of none. Though in this case, it would be more accurate to say jack of all trades, relative failure at many. Transitioning from MMA fighting to stand-up comedy, Schaub likes to consider himself a comedy genius. However, most of his fame has come through his connections with other more famous people rather than through anything he himself has done. Most notably, his connection to Joe Rogan, where Brendan Schaub has appeared many times on his podcast. One of the most infamous clips of Schaub on JRE would even go on to inspire the name for his first comedy special, and you'd be surprised. Which is how Joe Rogan politely implied that he would be obliterated in any fight with Cain Velasquez.
If you had a wrestling match with Cain Velasquez, how will you think you do?
Straight up wrestling?
Yeah.
I think people would be surprised.
Really? You think so? I think you'd be surprised. I really do. I think you'd fuck you up.
Schaub's insertion into Bobby Lee's life would begin on another podcast hosted by Kalila Kuhn called Trash Tuesday, where Kuhn and two other female comedians, Esther Povitsky and Annie Lederman, talk about current happenings and drama from the perspective of female stand-ups living in LA. In one episode from January of 2022, Annie mentioned an interaction she had with an unnamed married comedian she met at a party who tried to hit on her, asking her to, quote, walk him to her truck, with the obvious implication being that some backseat fun was going to take place. Kalila would chime into this, saying that the same comedian had previously tried to slide into her DMs around 7 years ago while she was still dating Bobby Lee.
When guys do that, it makes me so like, you just think I'm that. Yeah. I had a guy that was like, why don't you walk me to my truck, this married guy, where I'm like, and we know him, I'm not gonna say who it is, but he's like, why don't you give me a walk, why don't you give, like, you should walk me to my truck. I'm like, so what, I can blow you? Like, what?
Wait,
why would I?
Wait, I love that we have the same people that.
Yes, the same ones come.
Want us to walk for you? Oh, he came for me so hard, and we.
They never outright stated who this comedian was, but later dropped a hint that it was a comedian who isn't funny, and his initials were BS. Eagle-eyed mastermind genius sleuths, okay, working from inside the Matrix. Geniuses working on the case. Detective Sherlock Holmes on the Fighter and the Kid subreddit quickly realized that this was obviously Brendan Schaub and began making fun of him. The Fighter and the Kid is the name of a podcast Brendan hosted with his friend and fellow comedian Brian Callen, a guy with a somewhat unique sense of humor. Just kidding, Brian definitely has his moments. Now, you might be fooled into thinking a subreddit named after a podcast Schaub co-host will be a place where his fans would go and talk about their favorite comedian and his interesting and funny podcast episodes. But no, the posters on the Fighter and the Kid subreddit actively hate Brendan for being such an unfunny hack and spend most of their time cataloging his life. But it wasn't always this way. The Fighter and the Kid subreddit, much like many of his other career mishaps, is a beast of Schaub's own creation. At the beginning of the podcast run, the subreddit was made as a hub for actual fans who wanted a place to discuss everything currently going on with it. Early fans of the podcast enjoyed Schaub's perspective as an outsider who didn't grow up in a gilded luxury cage and was far more relatable than any other exorbitantly wealthy comedians and fighters. But slowly but surely, the curse of Los Angeles would claim Schaub's eternal soul, and his humanity was claimed by the beast, leaving only a hollow shell of greed and vanity behind. That is to say that as he gained more wealth and fame, Schaub became extremely egotistical and shallow, essentially morphing into every other douchebag LA influencer. It was after this point where the subreddit became a place to gawk at Brendan's increasingly bombastic and idiotic escapades, including this one. This event would very quickly gain the unofficial name of the Trugwalk incident by the subreddit, and many laughs were had at Brendan's poor attempt at seduction. Later on, Brendan would address the allegations on the Flagrant 2 podcast and claimed that Annie had made the story up, and he had a long conversation with Kalila Kuhn to discuss the incident, where she agreed with him that the story was fabricated.
What's with the Trash Tuesday beef? When are we gonna settle the Trash Tuesday beef?
It's settled as far as, you know.
Did you try to wog Annie Letterman to your truck?
No, it doesn't make sense. No, it doesn't make sense.
Why does it not make sense?
No, it's her perspective, and again, for it to get back to me, it has to get out of control.
I have nothing but love for her. When it comes to Kalila, it's like, I don't know, again, I don't mean her straight up had a conversation. That's how adults do it.
Not long after this event, the Trash Tuesday podcast would talk about potentially being sued by a certain unfunny comedian with the initials BS who may or may not have tried to wog someone to their trug. This, of course, is Brendan, who was rumored to be taking legal action. Kuhn was not happy with this retelling of events and decided that her and Bobby Lee needed to go on the H3 podcast to tell her side of the story and debunk Schaub's lies. On the podcast, Kalila would tell Ethan and Hila her version of the events that had actually happened when Schaub contacted her. As it turns out, the first lie that Brendan told was saying that he called Kalila in the first place. What actually happened is that Brendan had contacted her partner, Bobby Lee. He pulled Bobby into a call with many other comedians and began to confront him about what had happened and tried to force him to get Kalila to go on record agreeing with his version of events. If he didn't do this, Brendan and the other comedians threatened to completely ruin his career, reputation, and livelihood in response. Bobby himself had no idea what the call was even about, since at this time Kalila hadn't spoken to him about it at all. Despite being bullied and belittled by people he considered friends, Bobby didn't name anyone who was in the call on the H3 podcast. However, after some digging done by the subreddit, they alleged that the main person attacking him was none other than Schaub's co-host, Brian Callen. After this trash fire, Brian would later post an apology and say the main reason he had been so hostile to Bobby was because he believed that Bobby was responsible for 6 years of alleged attacks against Brendan and his family that were told to him by Schaub. It is worth clarifying that the so-called attacks Brendan was referring to was people making Reddit posts to mock him on the Flavor of the Kid subreddit. And sorry to be the one to break it to you, but if you can't handle Reddit users making fun of you, it might just be time to log off for a little while, okay? It might be time. So why would Brian think that someone as meek as Bobby would somehow have been able to spend the last 6 years of his life attacking Brendan and his family? Well, we would later discover the reason for this was because Brendan Schaub somehow thought that Bobby Lee was the person who owned the Fighter in the Kid subreddit and had been responsible for coordinating attacks, meaning mean Reddit posts, against him for the past 6 years. Bobby and Kalila would once again appear on the H3 podcast and discuss a confrontation they had with Schaub, where he again threatened to expose Bobby, but this time for somehow owning the Fighter in the Kid subreddit. And what made the entire story even more laughable was that Bobby Lee didn't even know how to use a computer.
They were like, we have evidence of something, right? So they go, we have 50 pages.
No, they said 300 pages.
Whatever of evidence.
Dude, Brandon Schwab can't even read, bro. How the that guy bringing 300 pages of anything? That guy's barely literate. Are you kidding me?
Well, there's a disconnect between the information he's being fed by his team. I don't think it's all him. Like, he's just like, I have 300 pages of proof that of an IP address that's linked to Bobby's. Listen to this, even linked to Bobby's computer. I was like, do you realize how tech stupid Bobby is? He answers phone calls on his iPad. Do you know what I mean?
My man.
Just like anybody born after 2005, he would write emails and do basically everything else from signing contracts to browsing the internet entirely on his iPhone or iPad and didn't even know how a desktop works. I don't even know how this guy functions, to be honest. He doesn't know how cars being towed works. He doesn't know how to use a fucking computer. Making the story even stranger, the supposed evidence that Brendan would produce was a zoomed in phone screenshot of HTML code showing Bobby Lee's email somehow inside the subreddit or something. Taking a page from Jesse Slaughter's father's book of internet cyberpolicing, Schaub also claimed that his team had backtraced the IP to Bobby's house, claiming that they had 300 more pages of evidence they were prepared to use in court against Bobby. Surprisingly, Brendan's bulletproof evidence of clicking inspect element on a web page and typing in Bobby's email address wasn't enough to convince the general public that Bobby Lee was a criminal, and he began taking even more from everyone online, making fun of his complete lack of computer literacy. Realizing that his Saul Goodman tier lawyer skills had failed to intimidate Bobby and Kalila, Schaub decided to go on the Tiger Belly podcast in an attempt to clear the air. Brendan responded to the accusations of bullying and extortion with such amazing arguments as, define bullying, and I didn't really mean it. This only made him appear even worse, and as a result of his terrible appearance, his rock bottom reputation would somehow manage to go even lower.
I say, Brendan, this is what was talked about in H3. Later that afternoon, Callen calls to
I'm
apologize.
actually confused right
Bobby
now.
for the bullying, threats, etc.
Take we clear bullying meaning define bullying for me. Like what? Like
it's crazy to think how all of this started from the trug walk joke caused by Brendan trying and failing to cheat on his wife. Yet somehow this wouldn't be the worst thing to happen to him, as over the coming months, he would manage to gain an even worse reputation for many other crimes that would be leaked by his handler after Schaub fired him for no reason. But this is where Bobby's place in the story ends, and in this case, you have to feel bad for the guy. He was dragged into a situation and threatened with a lawsuit entirely because of something Kalila said, which he had nothing to do with. However, this wouldn't be the only time Kalila would manage to land Bobby in hot water. In fact, this event was a mere appetizer of what was yet to come. At the center of the Tiger Belly podcast is Bobby Lee and Kalila Kuhn. It was their relationship and chemistry that made the podcast so entertaining to its many viewers in the first place. But it wouldn't take long for the audience to sour on Kalila, as over many years, she would begin to show her true colors, and the visible degradation of Bobby's mental state would get worse and worse, culminating eventually in Bobby being forcibly confined to a psych ward. Romance and business rarely mix, especially when the romance happens to be with an extremely mentally ill, allegedly bestiality-enjoying, allegedly incestuous abortion fetishist. There were red flags present even before the relationship began. Many of Kalila's scorned ex-lovers had brought to light her cruel and vindictive tendencies
Bestiality.
as a romantic partner. Those traits would be made very obvious by the long and complex separation between Bobby and Kalila that would occur in real time over the podcast run. Since the beginning, it's always been a point of contention with the audience whether or not Bobby and Kalila's relationship was toxic or abusive. It's difficult to gauge how healthy a relationship is when every person has a different definition of toxic. Twitter psychologists swing around the terms toxic and abusive almost as often as they call people fascists, which is to say constantly. However, taking an objective look at the relationship, it's clear that there were many different instances on the podcast where Kalila would say something that upset Bobby, only for her to brush it off after Bobby said he didn't like it. The largest and most contentious of the accusations levied by the audience would be that Kalila was a gold digger. Despite Kalila technically starting the podcast, it was clear that Bobby was the main reason most of the fans turned in every week. Along with the podcast, Bobby was also a semi-famous stand-up comic and a part-time actor. Both of these jobs paid quite well, and by the time the two began a relationship in 2014, Bobby had started to accumulate a decent amount of wealth. Kalila seemed to hate these accusations and would constantly deny them vehemently. Despite this, she would regularly throw gasoline on the fire by making comments on air, insinuating that the only reason she was with Bobby was because of his wealth.
You throw money at my tears, which is okay.
You know what? Hey, when you say that, it hurts my feelings.
Why?
Because what if we were poor? It would be more difficult.
If we were poor, Papa, we would be divorced because there's no way you know how to show me love.
After the clip of this interaction went viral and many fans on the subreddit began making fun of Kalila for it, she would go on the air to offer a whopping $2,000 prize for anyone who was able to dox the poster who originally uploaded the clip.
As a matter of fact, I'll give you any Tiger Belly listener $2,000.
Okay, doxing. I mean, come on now.
Find IP address of this person. Not his money, my money.
Her money.
In hindsight, it seems that the accusation of being a gold digger is one that seems to get under
It's just kind of rude
Kalila's skin the most. It's the one she spends the most time
and set up illegal.
even though there have been many far worse accusations that have been levied against her over the years. As mentioned earlier, the view among many of Bobby Lee's most ardent fans is that he's constantly struggling with low self-esteem. This opens a potential for any romantic partner to manipulate him by preying on his insecurities, as people with low self-esteem often seek to gain it from an external force such as a romantic interest. It's one thing to accidentally use someone's insecurities against them. Even in romantic relationships, people often haven't divulged their deepest insecurities to their partners, so it's certainly possible to accidentally overstep boundaries or touch on a raw subject that you didn't know about. However, it's entirely different to know what your partner is insecure about and then to not only use that insecurity to abuse your partner, but also personally take pleasure in that abuse. If you're thinking that nobody could possibly be that comically evil, then boy do I have a story for you. The breakup begins as many modern relationships do, with the introduction of polyamory. Guys and gals, if your partner ever suggests opening up your relationship, marry her right away. Put a ring on it. This is something you would expect Kalila to know all too well, considering both of her previous relationships fell apart after she tried to open them up and immediately either dumped the guy or got dumped herself. Seemingly undeterred by the 2 previous dumpster fires, Kalila would slowly try to begin introducing the idea of polyamory to Bobby Lee. It's displayed very quickly
polyamory works for like 1%
over the
population.
course of many podcast episodes that Kalila is trying hard to get Bobby to be comfortable with an open relationship. When they first started dating, Bobby had no idea what the word polyamory even meant. Each time that she suggested this, Bobby would vehemently oppose her, being obviously repulsed by the idea.
I think that he fantasizes about other dudes being with me and he gets off on it and he'll never admit to it. This road of love.
You should start out with a polyamorous relationship first, not monogamous to polyamorous.
Story that we create doesn't have to be defined by such strict rules of monogamy.
Whoa, dude, what are you saying right now?
Kalila would continue to bring this up to Bobby until she found the perfect opportunity. After Bobby Lee's father passed away, Lee relapsed on his drug and alcohol abuse and began once again abusing Vicodin. It's important to mention that Vicodin is similar in structure and function to morphine. It's an extremely powerful opiate, and getting off of it is almost as hard as getting off of other hard drugs. She waited until Bobby had relapsed and was at his weakest mentally to convince him to open the relationship. At the time, Bobby needed her to be there for him as a partner the most, and so she took the opportunity to get him into an open relationship. But how do we even know any of this? Frankly, should we care? I mean, not really, they're podcasters. But after this incident, even Bobby's own family couldn't keep quiet anymore. In March of 2022, a screenshot was leaked showing Bobby Lee's brother texting an unknown family member, saying in no uncertain terms that Bobby's relationship with Kalila was extremely toxic and extremely abusive. This leaked text message also revealed that Kalila had sent Bobby to what she believed was a rehab center to get him off of Vicodin, but was actually a psych ward in Tucson, Arizona. Bobby Lee would later add credence to this event when he spoke about his time in rehab.
So what we didn't know is the place had gotten bought out in the last year and is no longer a treatment center that is like, oh, here's a group of 20 people that we're gonna do intense work with. It's now like a rehab mill.
They're giving me 12 pills. I don't know what the fuck is in this thing. They had me in this room next to a man who was 65, I don't know how old he was, half naked, and literally, like, we're as close as me and Kalila is now, and he's going like this.
This is extremely atypical for a rehab center and sounds far closer to a psychiatric ward where they send patients with a large variety of mental issues. What's even more concerning is that Bobby wasn't even able to contact Kalila to let her know what was happening until days later, and she hadn't even read up on the place before checking him in. As the person who admitted Bobby to the psych ward, Kalila was the person who had conservatorship over him, meaning only she could ask to have him released. After days of asking the staff to be released, to which every time the staff would tell Bobby they needed to get in contact with Kalila, Bobby eventually went to a payphone to get a hold of her, and even after speaking to her, she failed to get Bobby released from the facility. Frustrated by the lack of progress, Bobby would call every family member he could before finally calling his manager Abby and telling her to threaten a lawsuit if the facility refused to release him, after which they finally did.
No one would let me go. They were like, no, you know what I mean? We have to talk to this and that. We can't get a hold of this. And this is days that go on. I can't get out. And I had to eventually tell Abby, I go, threaten law. So she did, and they wouldn't give me a ride to the airport. It was terrible. I was in the middle of the desert. They wouldn't give me a ride. No Ubers went out there. It was a nightmare. Anyway.
It's still unclear to this day why Bobby was unable to contact Kalila, as she's not spoken about it at all. The majority of fans seem to believe that Kalila used this time to escape to Hawaii, where she had allegedly been seeing a man she had a romantic relationship with. Well, this is not technically cheating, as it would have happened after the Vicodin relapse and Bobby agreeing to the open relationship. There's some evidence that she may have been seeing this man before they agreed to the open relationship, and he may have been the reason why she was so insistent on opening it. That being said, a lot of people tend to exaggerate these stories, and given that we don't know what happened behind the scenes, it's probably a bad idea to assume too much. Chances are whatever speculations are far more crazy than whatever actually happened. Luckily, Bobby was able to recover from his relapse and return to his regular life of podcasting and doing comedy, though he now had an open relationship with Kalila. This quickly proved to be too much for Bobby, and a mere 4 months after they agreed to the open relationship, Bobby told Kalila that it overstepped his boundaries and broke up with her. Despite this, they're still living in the same home together. Bobby had moved not only Kalila, but several members of her family, including her brothers, sisters, nieces, and nephews, into their large home.
Living in the same home.
After
Why?
the breakup, they continued to keep this strange living arrangement. Many fans have speculated the reasons for this, and theories range from Kalila having dirt on Bobby he knows she will reveal if he kicks her out, to Bobby simply still caring about her enough that he can't bring himself to have her leave. But the true reason remains a mystery to this day. Now, this next part is going to be the most disturbing of anything that's been covered so far. If you're eating anything or have a light stomach, I suggest tuning out now, and you can just let your imagination fill in what I'm gonna say. These are some of the most deplorable allegations that have been levied against a popular podcast host, so you've been warned. Although Kalila is Filipino and not white, her numerous stories about how much she loves her dogs might make her an honorary white woman. In many episodes of the Tiger Belly podcast, Kalila would tell stories about growing up in the Philippines and her childhood overseas. In many of these stories, Kalila mentions how she used to engage with dogs to completion back in the Philippines.
I used to jerk off dogs a lot, but this isn't a known thing. I learned from an older cousin.
Even Theo was like,
After significant fan backlash, she would attempt to clarify that she was actually forced to do it by her older cousin for his sadistic pleasure. Whether this is true or not, or just another attempt to shield herself from criticism is up for you to decide. Kalila has proven herself to be an immensely unreliable narrator, so who knows what the truth actually is. But if she's willing to bring it up so regularly, it might lend credence to the idea that it happened. If she made up the story for shock value, like what Bobby did, then it would make far more sense to say that to dampen the outrage rather than attempt to justify it like she did. That by itself might sound revolting, but believe me, it gets far worse. No longer in the Philippines, Kalila currently lives together with Bobby, where they have a total of 4 dogs. On an episode of the Bad Friends podcast, she would talk about how she's alone at home with nowhere else to go. She enjoys to free bleed. To anyone fortunate enough to not know what that means, I just wish I was you with straight places right now. After a day of free bleeding, Kalila would leave her pants and undergarments on the ground where the dogs would chew and roll around in the clothes.
Oh my god. So there was a pair of panties with blood on them and you just
workout sweat.
Workouts. Oh my god, rolling in it.
As if that wasn't bad enough, Kalila would also talk about having inappropriate relationships with members of her family.
I took another cousin of mine. I was 8 and she was 6. You know what I mean? It's like there were things that I probably did that were highly inappropriate for an 8-year-old because it was being done to me.
This also included her stepbrother. She would talk on the podcast about what happened, the 3rd time specifically being in a hospital. Her stepbrother would later end up taking his own life, but the reason why is never been made clear.
Did you have sex with your brother?
I possibly, but I did have sex with my stepbrother. He has since passed away. He killed himself. I had sex with a boy who I was told after I had sex with him that he could potentially be my brother. He does look like me. We're never going to do the DNA test because I don't think I'd be able to handle that. But there are whispers in the family.
YouTuber XLP posted a video on Kalila on July 31st, 2022, where he went over many of the strange and perverse poems she had written on her personal site. Previously, the site had been inaccessible to the public, and any attempts to reach it through the Wayback Machine or Internet Archive had been met with failure. XLP was able to get into the site through undisclosed means and managed to extract the poems for everyone to see. These poems range from everything to her writing about how she enjoys breaking relationships to strange erotica over her attraction to abortions. The poem on her website specifically talks about waiting until the fetus is 7 weeks in order to have have an abortion, which in combination with many of her other statements strongly implies Kalila gets some sort of perverse sense of enjoyment out of failed pregnancy. It wasn't a condom breaking or a mishap with birth control. Kalila made the decision to engage in intercourse, knowing there was a very good chance she would get pregnant, and she didn't take the morning pill, and then she waited
Abortionists, there's a people like
7
that.
weeks to get rid of this fetus. Now, I'm not going to step into the metaphorical or scientific minefield of pro-choice arguments or whatever, so let's instead just go off of what Kalila herself says. Because as with most crimes, what truly matters is intent. When talking about aborting 2 of Bobby's children, Kalila specifically uses the word kill, saying that she killed them. She also referred to them as Bobby's children. This would seem to imply that she gives them some sort of personhood, as you couldn't kill something that was never alive, and according to her, they were definitely alive. It's important to remember that all of this is alleged and similar to the Tijuana story. Just because Kalila says something happened doesn't mean it did. It could very well all be an elaborate joke to get a rise out of the public and to get a rise out of me, and in that case, I mean, it definitely did its job. These comment sections were filled with people being like, damn bruh, she stank, she's stinky. Even if that was the case, you have to wonder why she would fabricate so many stories to paint her in such an
NPC coming.
ferocious light and lead the fans to despise her and ridicule her at every turn and like never feel the need to ever explain herself. Instead of outright denying the stories she told actually happened, she constantly attempts to justify why she did them, which isn't what you would expect for someone with so much to lose or someone who's joking. Bobby and Kalila host the Tiger Belly podcast to this day to a decent degree of success. Hundreds of thousands of views every episode, sponsors, big guests like Dr. Drew, Jim Jeffries, Young Gravy. I mean, they're very successful to this day, and it's clear that despite whatever their toxic relationship may be, and despite these claims about Kalila, the empire is stronger than ever. Bobby Lee's a man of many talents. Very few people can claim to have a successful career as an actor, podcaster, and stand-up while being relatively well-liked in all those fields. He's managed to make a name for himself in possibly one of the most competitive entertainment markets of all time. And if you want my personal opinion, I think he's really funny. That Down syndrome story, it's hilarious. I'm sorry, it is, and he knows it is too. Unlike YouTube, where anyone can pick up a camera and upload their sick CS:GO surf gameplay and rake in millions, in traditional media, the road to stardom is a long and arduous path that's built through connections and a dedication to craft over years and years and years. I mean, he came out before the internet, but being so ruthlessly career-driven can often have severe consequences for up-and-comers and people they affect along the way. Bobby Lee certainly wouldn't have reached where he is today if not for his role on Mad TV, but maintaining that role meant he had to betray someone he considered a good friend, which is what led to a half-a-decade-long feud with Ari. The same could be said for the Tijuana controversy. As Bobby himself said, to make yourself stand apart, you're often encouraged to stretch the truth and tell crazy stories to make yourself look more interesting. Today, Bobby Lee seems to be in the best place he's ever been, with a successful comedy career, a popular podcast to promote that career, and a role in a major
Seems kind of associated to Tijuana.
service production. It seems that everything he had to suffer through has truly paid off, and no matter what his future may be,
Guess I will link
I've
that.
been Turkey Tom. Thanks for watching, and until next time, leave me alone.
I did that video.